Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rockford University Brown Bag Seminar of the semester. I would like to start by thanking Rockford University, the philanthropy and alumni engagement, and everyone who joins us today. Thank you for supporting the series. The Brown Bag series is organized by Professor Cabrera, who is with us today, Professor St. James, and myself. We have Dr. Yoandy Ortega Cabrera with us today. The title of his presentation is Myth and Politics in Cuba. Myth and Politics in Cuba. Dr. Yoandy Cabrera Ortega is an assistant professor of Spanish and classics at Rockford University. His research areas include classical reception, mythology, queer theory, and Hispanic poetry and theater. He has taught Hispanic and classical courses in Cuba, Spain, and the United States. He has also been an instructor of Spanish, classical Greek, and classical reception at Texas A&M University. He is an alumnus of American School of Classical Studies at Athens, where he was a part of ASCSA summer section in 2018. One of his most recent publications is Classical Ballet and Greco-Latin Tradition in Cuba, published in 2019. He is the editor of our departmental journal, Deinos. Did I pronounce it correctly, Yoandy?
Yes.
Dr. Cabrera Ortega has been appointed 2021-2022 visiting associate in Hellenic Studies at Harvard University's Center for Hellenic Studies. He also received a grant from the same institution for research expenses, a visit to the center during 2021 and 2022 academic year, as support for developing classics at Rockford University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cabrera. The stage is yours, sir.
Okay, I think you have to give me co-host permission again because I lost the connection and I had to use the Zoom way to access again.
Okay, it's not a big deal. Let's do it. Okay, you are co-host again.
Okay, I'll try now. Let me know if you can see the screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes. Good.
Okay, so I want to again saying that this is a work in progress. So feel free to just interrupt me at any question at any time. I love this kind of conversations when you have, a group of nice colleagues and we can talk in a more informal way. So, and it is also the spirit of the Brown Bag series, right? So,
Yoandy, I think somebody has a question. DF Fagan. Do you have a question to Yoandy or?
Sorry, no question. I was just responding to his, can you hear me?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, we can begin with a question in any case. I would love to do that. Okay. But the thing is that I have a question to begin, and it is why talking about myth and politics, right? When we decide to explore Cuba. Well, the main reason is academic. If you check the publications about mythology, Cuba, Greek and Roman heritage and Greek and Roman tradition in Cuba, you will not find very easily articles where politics and Cuba and myth are connected. In general, articles studying plays and literary works, and also piece of arts where myth and politics in Cuba are connected, try to avoid that topic. And it's something you can understand if you consider that Cuba is a dictatorship, where in any case, if you say something out loud or if you try to publish anything that is, connecting myth and politics in a way that the establishment doesn't like, then you might have a problem. So I understand why myself, right, and my colleagues in Cuba, when I was living there, when I was a professor there, why we didn't talk about these topics in a way I will present today. So that is the main reason why I began this project. And it began in a way that was also for me a surprise, because I just began to publish articles in different independent Cuban newspapers. Of course, if they are independent, they are not in Cuba, because the Cuban newspapers are really controlled by the government. So there are now a few publications from inside the island where you have, independent articles and independent news journalists, but that is not a common thing. Now, of course, you are checked and controlled all the time. But the thing is that I began to publish those articles, and then I realized I was like, some way, a little bit unconsciously, I was following this pattern, right? Myth and politics in Cuba. And then I decided to put them all together, including also academic articles, at least one. And then I decided to create like a new volume with those articles, and it is in the process. Just for you to have an idea, I just submitted the last article about this topic, and it is going to be published this week. So it's something that is going on right now. So, and the main reason is that this is a topic that is neglected and it is avoided, right? When you are inside Cuba, and the academia doesn't talk about it normally, trying to avoid those kind of complications with the establishment. So, well, this is a quote from one of Castro's speeches from 1971. It says, "We shouldn't develop any legend. We cannot and we shouldn't develop any myth." The thing is that I was asked to write an introductory chapter for an academic book about myth and politics in Cuba. Of course, when some colleagues saw that this topic was something that I was interested in, right? And then I began to check Castro's speeches, trying to find those moments when he was talking about myth and Cuba. And I was really surprised. Well, not very surprised, but it was really nice to find some kind of confirmations about what you could guess, knowing a little bit about Cuba. So I have talked before about myth and democracy, because I think that there is a really, really strong connection between myth and democracy, mainly when we talk about Greece. I think that democracy, some way, is also a response and a result of the mythological Greek system. And the main reason why I say that is because of the elasticity and the diversity and the natural way Greek mythology includes everything, not only in the past, but also in the present. So we continue talking about those characters. It doesn't matter if they are now placed in Cuba, the Caribbean, the United States, Latino culture, Spain, anywhere. We continue talking about those topics because of their elasticity to include a lot of topics that are also important for us today. But then, from the revolution perspective, from the Cuban regime perspective, what you're going to have is an unquestionable truth that for me is connected to the idea of dictatorship. So you're going to have a charismatic leader who is saying that he knows the truth. And then what Fidel Castro is doing in his speeches is some way what I'm trying to reflect with this table, with this kind of general summary of his ideas. So for him, myth is a result of capitalism, imperialism, and the United States. Because myth for him is lie, is lying. So, of course, Fidel Castro is a person in this case who is using the idea of myth as a lie, a common concept for popular people, who doesn't go, people who don't go deeper to talk and understand myth, right? And he's using that popular idea to make a kind of comparison and to divide into two important sections, his enemies, right, and his point of view. So myth is going to be a creation from the capitalism, imperialism, and the United States. And then the revolution and Cuba are going to represent an unquestionable truth. He's going to talk about revolutionary conviction opposed to the capitalist myth, for example. And of course, he's not only talking about Cuba representing the unquestionable truth, he's going to use also Palestine, the Arabic countries, Angola, and other Latin American countries connected to Cuba, to the regime, to say that they represent the unquestionable truth. In his words, it would be the revolutionary conviction. And then Israel, the United States, and other countries connected to the United States are going to be representing the capitalist myth, right? And also, they are going to represent injustice. At the same time, the revolutionary conviction is a representation of justice in general. And myth is a thing that comes from the past, right? So capitalism and imperialism is presented always by him from his perspective as something that is in the past, that we should like overcome and just leave behind us. So then his trick here is to talk about the revolution as an eternal present. And it is exactly the way it has been treated and presented in Cuba since 1959 until today. The revolution is alive. The revolution is happening right now. The revolution is something that will never end, something that will never get old, right, or older. So that is his perspective, and opposed to a myth of the past represented by capitalism. So then he's gonna present in those dichotomies he's using, he's gonna present the capitalist army and the capitalist police during the Batista regime in Cuba before 1959 as, part of the capitalism and that myth. And opposed to that, he's going to talk about the revolutionary police. Of course, the capitalist army, Batistian army, the Batistian forces were really, really cruel and bloody. That's true. But the revolutionary police is not exactly a paradise, or it's not exactly, a very positive creation. So, but he is presenting those as those kind of, concepts or institutions that are representing different perspective. For me, what is interesting here that is he's putting all these in this kind of oppositions between myth and the revolutionary conviction. And then the counter-revolutionary people are going to be called warm by him. And of course, they are part of the capitalist myth. And the revolutionary people are going to be called new men, hombre nuevo, from their perspective, right? A concept that is also in Che Guevara, and it comes from communist and Marxist authors, of course. And he's gonna work and animalize, right? And dehumanize those who are against the revolution, calling them worms. And then talking about the revolutionary men as new men. There is more, but in general, what I found is this, and I think that he found a very popular and schematic way to build these very basic dichotomies and oppositions, and they were very useful for him, at least during the 60s and the 70s. So then I already mentioned this, but I wanted to emphasize on the idea that the United States, Israel, and Batista's regime before 1959 are going to be the representation of the imperialist myth as an invisible system, according to him. And then he's going to talk about the Arabic countries, Israel, Africa, and Angola representing the revolutionary conviction. So, according to Fidel Castro, the idea of a myth is going to be a construction from the imperialist side, while truth and justice are going to be part of the revolutionary nature. The imperialist myth is trying to present a kind of system going against the revolutionary truth. And then Castro is going to talk about this in one of his speeches, exactly on July 26, 1966. But I will not quote that. I will just go and talk about one of the articles I wrote. This is a priest representing the Catholic Church in Cuba. He died some years ago. When I published this article, he was alive. The thing is that what I saw was a pattern again here. And this guy in 2017 was repeating those patterns we just mentioned in Castro's ideology, right? So what he's gonna do is going against a choreography. What happened was that a choreographer, a famous choreographer in Cuba, whose name is Rosario Cárdenas, created a play, right? A dance, and the name was Aphrodita or Mirror. That's the name. And she talked about Virgin Mary connected to Aphrodite and also connected to Ochun. Ochun is a Cuban African goddess, right? And who is mixed in the Cuban culture. She is mixed with the image of Virgin Mary. And then she found those connections between the Greek mythological character, Aphrodite, the Cuban African or Afro-Cuban goddess, Oshun, and then Virgin Mary. This priest, who was the most important figure from the Catholic Church at that moment, then decided to write a letter that was published. And then he began to use the concept of myth as legend, something that was not true, something that had to be rejected, opposed to the Catholic truth. And I saw a pattern there again. He was doing exactly something very similar to what Fidel Castro did with the idea of capitalist myth and revolutionary conviction, right? So then he began to talk in this letter. He's gonna write any name of a Afro-Cuban goddess, any kind of epithet used to mention those goddesses in lowercase. And then Virgin Mary is always in capital letters. Of course, in capital case. It's capitalized. So it was like, saying that any kind of African divinity would be a result of a false myth, and then the Catholic Church and Virgin Mary were representing the truth of God, God's truth, something like that. So I, of course, questioned that, and then I published this article questioning his perspective. I got a lot of emails and texts from Cuba, by the way. Of course, what happens in general with these newspapers published out of Cuba is that they are blocked in Cuba. So you cannot access them. The government is blocking all these pages all the time. So I got WhatsApp messages and emails saying, please, can you send me the article? I want to read it. I was told that you published an article about this, and I am really interested in reading it. So it was like a really nice experience. Then I found this article that was published in 2006. So I was in Cuba. I was about to finish my graduate classes, and that year, on August 12th, I was a new like TA, teaching assistant at the University of Havana. I was beginning my professional life as a professor. So then when I left Cuba, I didn't read this article in Cuba, or at least I don't remember it. So then when I left Cuba, I found this article, and then I decided to write something about it. And this is the picture of this, the screenshot of the newspaper where it was published. But for some reason now, if you try to access it, Fidel Castro's picture is gone. You cannot see it. It was a very funny picture by Fidel because he was doing something like that, like lecturing you, something like that. And then the main reason why I decided to write this article was because I didn't like the parallel. I thought it was not consistent. I thought it was not a good comparison. And I saw more differences than connections between Fidel Castro and Achilles. Of course, you can find connections everywhere. There are connections everywhere. But at the same time, you can find other points of view, and I'm trying to say the opposite to similarities, differences, Jesus Christ. So you can also find differences in everything. But from my point of view, you have more differences between Fidel Castro and Achilles than those connections and similarities you can find. And the main point in this article for me is that Achilles decided to leave the battle. Achilles took distance from the military space. He went to an area that was marked as feminine in ancient times. A man should have been fighting in the battle. He decided to stay, and he decided to go back. He didn't go back, but he said he would go back. And he stayed in his tent, playing music and singing poems. So my point of view is that Fidel Castro never, ever, even after his death, he has never left the battle area, the battlefield, right? He's always someone who is representing the military power, and he's always representing a militant, someone who is part of the party, someone who is the most important representative. But also in the Iliad, Achilles could question Agamemnon, and there were consequences, but he was not, disappeared. He was not sent to exile. Achilles could decide whatever he wanted. He could stay fighting even after questioning the most important king, who was Agamemnon. or just going back home. And they had a horrible argument, yes, but when Achilles was about to use his sword and fight Agamemnon and try to kill Agamemnon, Athena comes, the goddess Athena comes. No one can see Athena. The only one who can see Athena is Achilles. And she's gonna say, you can do whatever you want. See the difference, right? You can do whatever you want. That's very democratic. But my advice is, please stop fighting. Don't go against Agamemnon. Do not kill him. And we will give you as many awards as you want later. And then Achilles is gonna say, okay, I can wait. I will not kill him. And Athena is gonna say whatever you want. Just say horrible words, and that would be okay. And in the case of Fidel Castro, for example, I have a parallel when a writer, Reinaldo Arenas, who is a really important novelist, and also a really, really good poet, who was homosexual, who represented the sick body of the nation, who was very promiscuous, sexually active, against the revolution, representing literary movement, etc., went against the establishment, he was erased. He had to find a way to leave the island. So no, I don't think we can have a lot of similarities between Fidel Castro and Achilles. I see more differences, and very, very important differences. And that's why I decided to write this article. So, well, this is what is happening in Cuba, mainly before he died and after he died. You see children with those kind of zombie phrases, yo soy Fidel, right? If you see the Walking Man, you're gonna hear something like that, very similar when there is a charismatic leader and they decide to follow him. And then I wrote an article also about this artist. He wrote this graffiti when Fidel Castro died. So his name, his artistic name, is El Sexto, the sixth. But then the graffiti is right here. And it says, he is gone, nothing more. But also in Spanish, grammatically talking, that is only one word, se fue. In Spanish, that is se fue. And that is one word. So that was enough to take the artist and have him in jail, in prison for a period of time in Cuba. Eventually, he's going to leave the island. But I really like this way to question, right, the establishment in Cuba, because the only thing he did was writing a word, just writing a word. And that was enough for the government in Cuba to be worried and to be questioning him and having him in jail. And I oppose that perspective where you have only one single word to the never-ending speeches by Fidel Castro in his life. Fidel Castro was a man who had speeches for 10 hours, no stopping speeches for 10 hours, and people were there. It didn't matter it was sunny, it didn't matter it was raining, people were there. So I like that idea that this artist is gonna write only one word, and that word is gonna be a way to question and destabilize a guy who was talking and talking and talking and talking all his life. And then we had the popular protest in Cuba on July 11th, 2021. While we're having this presentation, some artist Black people, by the way, are in jail because they went out that day and they took a video, a photo. They didn't do anything against any building, or they didn't try to destroy anything. That was enough. Just going out and taking any picture or a video was enough to be in jail for more than 2 years. And you, for example, find people who were sentenced 5 years in jail because they just went out. Of course, they are, artists and also activists, very active activists, and that's the reason why they are in jail today. So for that reason, I decided to write more than one article, by the way. All these protests began with San Isidro movement. The two guys I'm thinking about right now, Michael Osorbo is one of them, and Otero Alcantara is another one. They are part of the San Isidro movement. They created San Isidro movement. So the protest began with them, and then young intellectuals and artists are going to go in front of this big house, right? A house, of course, that was built before 1959, where the Minister of Culture is in Cuba. And I saw these big gates, and I saw this beautiful house as a kind of palace where the minister, right, would come out and talk to the crowd. And I thought about Oedipus at the beginning of Oedipus the King, where he goes out and says, what is going on? How can I help you? But if you know about Oedipus the King, you know that Oedipus is the same reason why people are suffering. So yeah, I made those connections, right, between the Cuban government and the figure of Oedipus as a dictator, representing, by the way, again, truth, unquestionable conviction, a charismatic leader, the representation of a wise guy, right? The same way, the Cuban government has its figures, right? And that's why I also wrote these articles. And these pictures are about the last article I just submitted 2 days ago to be published this week, right? And this is a building in Camagüey, one of the provinces of Cuba. It is in the east area of the island. But the thing is that if you see these figures, human figures, are like caryatids. They are female figures. And this is a very iconic and representative building, part of the Cuban heritage, right? The Cuban cultural heritage. But the problem is that it is in ruins and the government is not taking care of it. So in 2020, there were some kind of destructions here, right? And then people who were living in those houses, I think that one of the problems here is that this is not a government building, right? This is a building that is owned by common people, and they don't have resources and products to fix this, right? So there were some destructions during 2020, and people began to talk about it, right? But that was not enough. No one died at that moment in 2020, but the architects, people who were concerned about how important this building is, and also concerned about the families who are living here, because this is a multi-familiar building where they were protesting online and saying that was happening. Of course, the official newspapers in Cuba didn't say anything about it. And then see how damaged the building is, even from outside. And if you see, there is a piece missing here. Well, a man from this city was walking some days ago, like it was on February 18th, and he was not a lucky guy because he was hit by this piece that went down, and the guy was hospitalized and he died. So then we had that thing in the news again. And my connection with Greek myth here is how, you know, the Cuban heritage, the cultural heritage in Cuba is damaged. It's in ruin in many cases. And they don't take care of it mainly and maybe because it's, you know, a private building. And but people who are around this area see people walking here, these guys working there, because the second floor is a multifamiliar building, but the first floor, those are stores and other kind of businesses, right? So people are walking in that area, around that area all the time. And then I began to find some information, and I realized there was right in front of this building in ruin, there was a hotel that was rebuilt in 2021. But of course, it's for tourists, and that's a priority for the Cuban government. But my point in my article is that, well, the tourists and human beings coming from Cuba or living in Cuba, or Cubans or not, are gonna be walking around this area. So I guess that even from the tourist perspective of the Cuban government, they should take care. They should care about it, right? They should take care of this building. This building was constructed at the beginning of the 20th century, between 1905 and 1915, and it's a really peculiar building in this province. It's the only one with this very specific columns with the female figures, right? Representing caryatids, similar to those in the Erectaion in the Athenian Acropolis. And this is another building. And you would say, well, but this is well preserved. So the Cuban government is taking care of some of them. Well, no. This building was restored by the Spanish government. And the price of the restoration was more than 2 million euros. But then Fidel Castro had problems with Aznar's administration in Spain in 2003, and he decided to close this building where there was a Spanish institution. And then he took the building after it was repaired by the Spanish government. So I will stop right there. There are other articles, of course, but I just wanted to share with you some of the ideas and the connections between mythological figures, mythological characters, politics, and Cuba. And just, you know, share with you this project that is right now in process. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
I'm just
Yeah,
like,
go ahead, please.
I'm fascinated by the buildings, Yoandy. Those buildings are so symbolic, are they not? Of like 100, I mean, the weight of the decaying building, right? And then of course the one that's restored by the Spanish government and then closed down. Like that's cool. I can see why you'd latch onto that and go, wow, this is.
Yoandy, I have a question. Do you think,
good,
which one do you think is more exploitable or used by governments? Is it myth or religion or both?
Yeah.
Well, the Cuban government decided to go against both, but mainly against religion, because, you know, myth is something that it doesn't affect because it's a cultural construction. It's not a belief anymore. You don't believe in Aphrodite, right? You don't pray to Aphrodite to finish the Cuban government, right? But you pray to God, right? And you ask God, please help us, right? So at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, I may say that the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church in Cuba supported, publicly supported the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban government and Fidel Castro. But then, very quickly, Fidel Castro decided to go against any religion. And then he
Turkish
began
government
to,
has the same problem, and it's using religion very effectively.
can you repeat that?
I said we have more or less, when I say we, I mean Turkey, a similar problem, which is like religion is very effectively used and exploited by the government, very effectively. Instead of going against it, just use it. Why not? Like it's
exactly. But that's what eventually the Cuban government is gonna do. First, fighting against them. It was very common when I was a child that, you know, the preacher was a guest, and then he didn't arrive on time to have, you know, the service. And then the first time we were surprised and concerned. The reason why he was not on time was because he was in prison. And the reason why he was in prison is because he was visiting the hospital and praying for people, and the police arrived and took him and put him in prison. Yeah, because it was not something you could do. And I am talking about 1991, 1992. And then it was the first time, it was the second time. And then the 10th time was like, don't worry, Luisito is in jail. He would come back maybe before 10 p.m. It was a common practice. But then they found a way to use religion. The same way they have found a way to use gay people and trans people, because they went against gay people at the beginning of the revolution. In 1965, Fidel Castro created concentration camps for religious people and for gay people and for those who were not revolutionary enough. And the slogan of that place was, the revolution is gonna make them men. Yeah. So, but in the last years, they have begun to use those things like religion, gay rights, gay people, trans people, to say that the revolution is so big that they are part of the revolution now. They don't talk about what they did in the past. And if they talk, is no, it was not Castro's fault. Someone made that mistake. And there was a moment when Fidel Castro, some years ago, he said, it was my responsibility. Yeah, I did that. But then, you know, his cousin went public and said, no, my uncle is so a nice person. He's taking all the responsibility, but it was not him. Something like that. And about the buildings, I may add that you cannot imagine. One of my points in my last article is that that kind of really broad heritage coming from Europe, Greece, and Spain is everywhere in the Cuban architecture. And you find so many caryatids, so many Aphrodites, so many Atlantis, those guys who are the same columns, but they are men, right? Everywhere. They are really beautiful, right? But I wanted to use these two iconic buildings because there have been some issues with them. And I'm sorry for, you know, Cuban people and this Cuban guy who lost his life because this kind of neglected behavior of the Cuban government, right? But also, I'm sorry for the Cuban careerists who have been involved in all these kind of political issues and ruins, and because this building was closed by Fidel Castro when Spain and the group of 15 countries from Europe decided to question the Cuban regime because they killed 3 people who took a boat to leave the country, and they were condemned to die. Yeah, it was death penalty, and then the Europe Union and 15 countries from the European Union wrote a letter against that decision. And that was the moment in 2003, exactly, when the Cuban regime decided to take this building restored by the Spanish government. It was in 2003 when the Cuban government took 75 activists and independent journalists, and they went sent to jail. And they were released only when the Catholic Church in Cuba intervened, talked to Raúl Castro, and some of them were sent to Spain, exiled. But they couldn't stay in the country if they were released. If they were released, yeah.
Any other questions, everyone? Well, then if there's no questions, we might adjourn our meeting. Thank you so much, Yoandy. That was a wonderful, very interesting and very insightful. And I have never known that if you didn't present it, at least from my perspectives. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, Yoandy. It was wonderful.
Yeah, Yoandy.
Guys,
Thank you.
Our next
What?
presentation is going to be on April the 10th. It's going to be Dr. Kristen Revel. And then until then, I wish you a great spring break, by the way. Next week is spring break. Thank you so much, Yoandy, once again, and hope to see everyone on April 10th.
Well, thank you all for listening to me.
It was fun. Thank you. Really.
Thanks.
Thank you, Yoandy.
It was.
It's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
I gotta